Welcome to Navigating Wealth, a podcast where we apply a high net worth lens to economics, investing, and lifestyle questions. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Jonathan Eirich. Jonathan is the co-CEO of Rideback, the Hollywood production company behind blockbusters like Aladdin and the Lego Movie. He's also co-founder of Spurry, an AI-powered animation company. His recent projects include Avatar: The Last Airbender and Lilo and Stitch. In today's episode, we cover the Warner Brothers bidding war, the economics of producing billion-dollar blockbusters, why bad movies get made, whether AI will really change the way movies are created, and much more. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to Navigating Wealth. I'm Tad Fallows.
Hi, I'm Sriram Galapalli.
And I'm Matt Scheckman.
And today we are very fortunate to have John Eirich join us. John, rather than me giving you background, why don't you go ahead and just give us a quick thumbnail of your career journey? I think it'd be a fascinating place to start.
Sure, absolutely. I'm currently the co-CEO of a major Hollywood production company called Rideback. I'm also the co-founder of an AI-powered content animation company called Spurry. But I could sort of back up and get to how we got there. So I went to Harvard for undergrad. I was a history and literature of America major and wanted to be a screenwriter. So I came out to Hollywood for that and then quickly got a job at CIA, which is one of the major talent agencies out here where you sort of make your contacts and find out about the business. And thought I was going to try to become a writer's assistant and go the writing route, but I ended up working for a woman named Stacey Snider, who at the time was number one on the Hollywood Reporter most powerful people in Hollywood list at that moment. She was running Universal Studios in the early 2000s. So I joined her as sort of a creative assistant, and she ended up partnering with Steven Spielberg, leaving Universal and going to DreamWorks Amblin. So I came there with her, where I was later promoted a creative executive, which is sort of the lowest rung on the Hollywood totem pole, where you sort of get off somebody's desk as an assistant and you actually have your own phone and your own sort of agenda, although you're mostly just sort of servicing more senior executives' projects. And stayed at DreamWorks for 9 years as an executive and rose up to senior vice president, overseeing a number of movies and working on the first two Transformers movies, but also The Help. And the last one was Bridge of Spies, the Steven Spielberg directed and Oscar-nominated film, which was something I found as an executive that didn't even have a producer on it at the time. And I felt very sort of producerial, and we could sort of get in what is the difference between a producer and a studio executive in a moment. But I always felt very producerial, very hands-on as a studio executive. And I sort of thought after Bridge of Spies, like, maybe I should just go off and try to do this. So my then boss, Stacey Snider, left to run 20th Century Fox before it was absorbed by Disney. And she had a non-compete in her contract and ended up sort of freeing me up to think about what else is out there. And ultimately partnered with a guy named Dan Lin, who had a company called Lin Pictures, and he had just sort of had his first really big movie come out that year. This is in 2014, which was the Lego Movie. And he was getting a deal that was going to allow him to greenlight 3 more animated Lego movies. And he's like, I finally have the chance to sort of really scale up, and I want to bring you in as, sort of my partner here. And I want to take my name off the company. I want to rebrand it. I've never really wanted the company to be about me. I wanted to create a brand that could outlive me. And that was sort of his pitch from the get-go. And he even talked about building a campus, a sort of Pixar-like campus in Los Angeles. And I was like, I don't know what of these dreams we're going to be able to pull off, but there was an ambition there that I really liked. He was a Harvard Business School guy. He was very great, smart at sort of the business itself and sort of running the infrastructure of the company, but also gave me a lane to really run creative across the board at the company. So I joined him in 2015. So I've now been here for a decade, and we've made a number of films and TV shows together, and everything from obviously the Lego franchise, but then also the Stephen King It franchise at New Line. I produced the live action musical Aladdin with Will Smith. It grossed over $1 billion at Disney. I also just this year produced the live action version of Lilo and Stitch, which also grossed over $1 billion for Disney. A number of movies in between, as well as some TV shows, including the live action version of Avatar: The Last Airbender, which was the biggest American show on Netflix a year ago, and season 2 is going to come out next year, and then season 3 the following year. So that's just sort of a small sampling. But then the other sort of big shift that happened in our company at the top of 2024, there was a change at Netflix. The chairman of Netflix Film was let go, and ultimately Dan Lin was hired as chairman of Film. So a lot of 2024 for us was exciting, and he ended up going over to Netflix and sort of bestowing the company on myself and my co-CEO, Michael LaFaso. So we run this company together, as well as Spurry, the animation company. Dan is now sort of fully extricated from the company at Netflix, but we have a first look deal at Netflix, so we're still, very close and working in a different capacity. But he's now in a very high level job, and a very one that's under constant media scrutiny. But he's loving it over there, and he's sort of given us the chance to sort of grow the company on our own now.
Well, thank you so much for that background, John. And then maybe just directly build on it. The word Netflix came out of your mouth a couple of times there, and I think particularly timely over the past couple of weeks with the Warner Brothers Discovery acquisition, and not acquisition, potential acquisition. So curious to hear your, we probably all have opinions, but curious to hear your take on that deal and the bidding war. I think it's been a while since there was a bidding war for Hollywood stocks. It seems like, as a longtime Disney shareholder, that has gone nowhere for a long time. And, probably similar for Warner Brothers. So can you talk, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting mood right now in Hollywood. There does seem to be a bit of doom and gloom, especially around the Netflix announcement in particular. I have to say, and obviously we have a first look deal at Netflix, so we're biased here in to some extent. But like, I'm not sure I see all the downsides that everyone else is seeing. I think the larger downside that I do think everyone is generally just disappointed about is consolidation. But it sort of feels like that's happening across the board in every industry. So we can sort of be sad that consolidation exists and is sort of subsuming businesses across the board, or we can just sort of acknowledge that the moment the company was purchased in 2022 by David Zaslav, like the intention was clear. He sort of made it known to a lot of people close to him that the point was to sort of strip it down a bit, get rid of some of the debt, and sell the company. And the reality is all these studios used to be owned by companies in other businesses. The Bell Western owned Paramount in the 70s. Seagram's bought Universal in the 90s. Even, Time Warner and AT&T, or adjacent businesses don't really have those buyers anymore. Like the people who want to own movie studios are other movie studios who can sort of, take over the IP and figure out ways to consolidate their business, especially on streaming platforms. So I don't know what the outcome was going to be. I think it's a sad day in a way for Hollywood that sort of Warner Brothers as we knew it, which, when I was coming up, that was the Yankees. It was the biggest studio in town. They made the most movies. They had Chris Nolan. They had Clint Eastwood. All these people were on the lot, like in their bungalows, like, and whenever I would lose a project as a studio executive at DreamWorks, more often than not, it was to Warner Brothers. And you're kind of like, well, they have an amazing exec staff. Like they were just the best in the business. So I think where the studio is sort of gone or sort of fallen to at this point, I think is disappointing for a lot of people, but I'm not sure that whether Paramount had acquired it or Netflix had acquired it would have been vastly different, and I know they're sort of having their own media war right now, kind of trying to convince everyone of like why they're the best ones, but at the same time, like, again, they were going to consolidate one way or the other, and there's going to be one less streamer out there in HBO Max that you could sell to. And there's probably going to be fewer theatrical movies, in the combined studios, whether it was Paramount or Netflix. And, Netflix so far has said they're actually going to continue to release theatrical films through Warner Brothers. The point to buy a giant distribution studio wasn't to immediately shut it down and move all those properties to streaming only on Netflix. So I kind of have to take Ted at face value to some extent. Like I do think if he says all that right now and then lands the company in 18 months and immediately shuts down all theatrical distribution, like there will be a riot of sorts in Hollywood. Like I don't think he wants that. So I think they will maintain some theatrical, but again, this is just all the things that have happened since 2015, 2016 in our business that are just the reality that the business changed. It changed dramatically, and it's never going to go back to the way that I think we all wanted it. So
can you explain a little bit to listeners who are not primarily working in Hollywood, what is that fundamental economic driver there? that is causing these, pains?
Yeah, I mean, it's so many things. It's like you could go all the way back to when the DVD market dried up. That was a very lucrative ancillary revenue that a lot of movies that you would have thought maybe lost money actually didn't, because home video was so strong. It was such a profit. I mean, selling DVDs for $30 that cost 7 cents to make. I mean, it was a dream. And, then that sort of went away, and then there was doom and gloom. But then they sort of found, the PVOD and iTunes and other versions to monetize. But then streaming came along, and again, I think shifted that in a significant way. It obviously altered the TV business for forever, but it also altered the film business. I think COVID couldn't have happened at a worse time also for the theatrical movie going business. I don't know if it's some of the habit of going to movies just shifted as well. So theatrical movies, not that they necessarily made more money back in the day, but there were more of them. So it was almost like Hollywood was a bigger mutual fund back then. You had so many bets. Every studio was making 30, 35 movies a year. There was a lot of people that you just went to the theater because it was a thing you did. Now I think it's a thing you solely go for a destination. Is there a movie you really want? What time is it playing? Is it at a theater you like? Can you buy seats in advance? Are they comfortable seats? Okay, I'll go. That's a different thing than even early 2000s, or I think there was a habit of let's just go, let's see what's playing, or like, I just want to go see a movie. I heard it's not great, but let's just go. I think we've moved on from that. I think the amount of choice that people have has shifted that, and so studios then started making fewer and fewer movies. And then they sort of decide we're only going to take the really big bets. And then some of the really big bets can fail. And then that's scary. And then you don't want to take some of those other big bets because you only made 10 movies last year and 6 of them were big and 4 or 5 of those didn't work. So, and there's not really a revenue stream behind it to sort of pick up the pieces in the way there was before, and then there was this sort of shift of like, let's just spend money on getting all eyeballs on streaming, and there was a moment where everybody was spending to try to beat Netflix at its own game, which I think proved to be unsuccessful, and a lot of money was sort of spent and lost where the people realized streaming only films don't necessarily catalyze interest or subscriptions in the way we thought they might. In fact, usually big theatrical films with big theatrical global marketing campaigns do better on streaming because the movie was bigger in theaters and you're actually more likely to watch it again on streaming. So everyone just sort of like the landscape kind of keeps shifting. And then the reality is movies have gotten more expensive to make. So everybody wants movies for cheaper, and they sort of look at a movie that's maybe $150 million movie in 2017. Could we do that for 125? Because the models and the economics actually say maybe that same movie in 2017 for $25 million, we could win on that. But if you look at just interest and cost and inflation and guild changes and all these other things that have affected our business, a $150 million movie in 2017 is probably the equivalent of a $209 million movie today. So you're like, well, I want that same thing, but I want it for less. And you're like, right, but it costs a lot more. So I think all of this has just created more and more of these pain points. And I think the companies that have other revenue streams, obviously Disney has a huge merchandising, and they've got parks, they've got other things that can find value in these movies. Netflix has a subscription base that isn't really changing. Like they pretty much know what the revenue stream is going to be every year. A lot of the other studios don't have these things baked in, so there's just a lot of fear that has been, that has always existed in our business, but I think has been maximized in the last few years and everything just feels harder.
So, based on it sounds like there's a lot of different moving parts. If you were to break it down, who are the winners and the losers here? It seems like consumers are in some way the winner and that they can pick and choose their service. They can get it arguably significantly cheaper than your $30 DVD. And then arguably Netflix is a winner, just the distribution model. I mean, that's probably a significant oversimplification, but where is the shift going, and how much of this pushback is purely economic driven versus more sentimental, or this is the way that the industry has always been, and so that's where the pushback is coming from, whether it's the screenwriter strike and the guilds or other
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the pushback is definitely sentimental, but it's also related to the economics of that shift. Like there are fewer movies getting made, so there's fewer jobs, there's fewer TV shows. But if you look at it, I think it was 2019, I think there's 520 shows made. There's 365 days in the year. Do we need 520 shows? Like we probably didn't. But a lot of people got paid a lot of money. That's a lot of jobs. It's a lot of writing jobs. That's a lot of production jobs, and there was probably going to be some right sizing of all of this. Like all of it was getting made in this, this arms race for streaming. And now we're probably down to 200 shows a year. It's a huge, huge shift for people. So there are people that are not getting jobs, or when the jobs come up, quite frankly, studios can afford to pay less. You can pay a writer less because there's not as many jobs. So I think there is some of it is like, man, I wish it was like the old days, which I think everybody does. And then there's the reality of like, man, there was a lot of jobs in the old days and they paid more, and now, a lot of these situations you're in, especially with streaming, like you don't get a back end either, so there's a lot of people who felt sort of, necessarily the pain, but you make something that's a hit on streaming and you have given away your back end, hopefully enough, you got paid up enough up front that it was worth your while. But there was an era, 15, 20 years ago where like you had a huge hit as a producer, as a piece of talent, as a director, you'd be seeing checks on that for another decade. And so you might have a lean year, but it's okay. I'm still getting paid on that thing that was a huge hit, 6 years ago. That doesn't really happen anymore, So, I mean, very rare circuit. Maybe you make the horror movie that you're Jason Blum and you've got the economics on a horror movie that's a low budget, that's in pure profit, but there's just not that many of those. So I think that's hard for people too, that, it just feels like you're going job to job, movie to movie, show to show to sort of make a living, and I think sometimes that can foster less interesting creative choices. I think that is the downside, if everything is sort of boom times economically, you can sort of choose like, do we need this movie? Is this worth it? Do we need this show? Do I want to work on that show? I think a lot of people, especially in my position as producers, it's sort of like, hey, if you can get a green light, you're probably pushing towards that, whether you think this is, going to be the most significant piece of art you've ever made or not. Like you've got to find a way to get things made in this climate. So, I think it does lend to a lot of people trying to jam things because everyone needs to eat. Everyone needs a job. Everyone needs something in productions. And then to your sort of former question, this sort of the more macro question. Yeah, I think Netflix has been a winner sort of all along. I think you sort of always suspected that somebody would come from outside Hollywood to reshape Hollywood, and they were the ones that did it. They got there first with a model and enough content that it was, the thing that really shifted people's thinking around the way they consume things, and I think they think YouTube is their biggest competitor a lot of times, more so than they think about, Disney or Warner Brothers or Paramount or any of those studios. So, I think there's like a sort of shift over there happening. Then there's Amazon, which is like a unique model because, there's a lot of things Amazon does that is based on things they think will foster the core business. Let's make a show with this actor who has a line of products that we think is the most, that sells X, Y, and Z, on Amazon. That's a weird way to think about things, And so as like a creative person, it's a strange thing of like, okay, what makes sense for Amazon? Who should be cast in this because that might make more or less sense for them, but their business just runs in a slightly different way than a traditional model of like, you make a movie for this budget, got to make X money or it's a failure. Like theirs is slightly different. So, I don't think it's the same playing field across our business now, which is also an interesting thing.
So you said a couple things that are maybe counterintuitive to the lay user. One of which is that there's a lot less being produced. Like I always say with my wife sitting on the couch, there's so much more content out here that it's hard for me to find the stuff that like we really want to watch. It's interesting to me that there's actually less being made, and maybe that's the foster of the change from cable to streaming, and a lot of the stuff on cable maybe isn't being produced. But in particular, you mentioning the long tail of royalty kind of payments and things like that is changing. Is that contractual, or is that just the changing consumer dynamic of we're just not watching things that are 5 years old anymore? and it's a lot more fleeting.
Well, what's funny is like when they make a licensing deal for Friends or for Seinfeld, anyone involved in those shows is getting paid the way they got paid 25 years ago. So like there might be a 400, $800 million licensing deal for 5 years or 10 years of one of those shows. All that money is going to that pool of talent from 20 years ago and is being paid out in the same way. But the model has changed for more recently and going forward. Again, it sort of started with Netflix that decided they would do back-end buyouts. And so the concept of this was, let's say you're a $1 million producer. They would then say, you're producing this kind of a movie. It's similar to these kinds of movies. Normally that movie would probably make X at the theater. If it made X, you would probably have made $1 million as your back-end buyout. That's sort of the middle case. So we're going to give you actually $2 million up front. So initially producers were like, okay, wait a minute. Like, so I'm guaranteed 2 million. I actually will only be paid 1 million at a traditional studio. And I'd have to hope that the movie at least made that much, but if it were bad and it made nothing, you might just make $1 million total as a producer. Now you're guaranteed 2. However, in that, though, you never know. And that's the whole thing of Hollywood. It's like nobody ever knows when these things break out and turn into these massive hits. But that case, you might have made 10 as a producer, and you're sort of giving up that upside because you're like, I'm just going to take the $1 million in the bank, and that feels good. And initially, those back-end buyouts also were, I would consider, overpayments, because they were trying to get people in to work at Netflix, and then other streamers copied it too. And there was, then there was an arm race over talent. So we're going to overpay what Netflix is going to overpay. But then at a certain point, when you don't have to overpay people to work at Netflix, when there's only so many buyers, you can start kind of cutting down what those back-end buyouts are. So, again, they'd probably get slightly right-sided, and they're still, can be very good economically, but they're never going to be the hit. You're never going to be paid for, the massive breakout success in the way you were before. And television sort of followed suit as well. So, it just, in the end, like all this stuff is about leverage. It's like producers, writers, talent, they've lost leverage more and more over the years, and the few people that have it, like Greta Gerwig's got it, like she's, there's few people that in the business, and the ones that do, I think still get incredible, Ryan Murphy got that incredible showrunning deal a couple years ago. Like no one's had more hit shows than he has. But I think, again, like a lot of businesses, like the top 0.1% probably can do better because you have leverage. But for everyone else who has none, you sort of have to, we need something to get made, whatever you're willing to pay. And, you can point to quotes because that's usually how a business works. If you're a $1 million producer at one studio, you get paid $1 million at the other studio because that's my quote. There's times where people, yeah, I know that's your quote, but, this is a slightly lower budget movie, so we can only afford to pay $500K, Do you want to do it or do you not? Do you want to, and then all of a sudden everyone's sort of like, well, to get something made, I'll have my fee or do other things. And, again, suddenly everyone's working for less and you've just had an overall paradigm shift.
And do you think is it now clear where things are going to end up, or are we still, in a phase of uncertainty? And maybe what I have in my mind as background to that is we've had some conversations recently with people more in the songwriting business and like the, master recordings and that sort of thing. And there, it seems like they hit this nadir with, all right, all our traditional CD sales are going away, nothing's picking it up. And now it seems like it really has stabilized and re-entered this growth phase of, hey, Spotify is paying enough to sort of cure all ills. Do you feel like we're sort of at that point of confusion, or is the future clear?
I think the future is clear that if you really want a home run, you should probably figure out a way to do it yourself, and it's like you look at a Mr. Beast or you look at, some of the creators there. And it's a way why we started Spurry, which was our animation company, which we did a sort of low 8-figure raise for to get off its feet, but also to partner with big pieces of IP that we have the resources to just go make animation that we can control and own. We could license it to studios. We could go direct to consumer. There's other ways we could do it. We could make original animation. Maybe that leads to original merchandising. Like there's so many things that you can potentially do. Obviously, it only works in success when you have a hit, but at least when you have a hit, you're the owner of it. And I think a lot of people have talked about ownership in general, which is you just have no leverage at these studios, And so I think the reality is that's not going to change, and you're still going to want to work on some of the big budget things at studios. Obviously, AI is coming, and AI is going to change that in a big way too, and if in 5 years you have the resources where you can make a movie that has the scale of Star Wars, and you don't have to go to Lucasfilm or Disney for the $250 million it costs to get that. I mean, that can change things too. So, but I do think if people really want to bet on themselves, if they want home runs, it's going to be, finding a way to do it in a way with ownership, and I don't think that's going to change in our business.
Well, maybe we can double click on that a little bit, Jonathan, especially because you mentioned Spurry, you mentioned the AI's role a little bit. I think this morning, depending on when this gets released, Disney announced they're putting $1 billion into OpenAI for licensing. How do you see the future of content production? And to your last point around the volume has gone down, I think the volume is only going to go up. And now with legitimizing some of these things, you might see real content really coming out, or real, I guess, in the sense of characters we recognize in areas that we may not be. And you might get home movie people making Mickey Mouse sort of things to the degree that they allow that, or maybe it's just internally used. I'm not sure. But yeah, love to kind of understand, and that the economic model. In theory, the $150 million movie you talked about before might not cost $209 million now. It might cost back maybe $100 million now because the cost has come down from the labor economics and other kinds of things in producing the same, if not better quality. Clearly, you're heavily invested here, both personally and thinking about it. I'd love to hear how you see that as the role in the future here.
Yeah, I mean, the Disney thing is interesting. I think their decision is based on that sort of inevitability idea, like this is going to happen anyway. So we'd rather control it and be involved in it and generate revenue from it than allow this to sort of run rampant and happen anyway, and I mean, you can argue, was there a way they could have protected that from ever happening, and how successful would studios have been in the lawsuit that has been ongoing with OpenAI? I don't know. It was a, can you beat them or do you join them moment, and I think they decided to join them, and will probably benefit significantly from that revenue stream. And I do think it's a little bit like, to some extent, when like home video cameras got invented, it was like, everyone can be a director. You can be a director at your own home. Like how many great directors came out of owning a home video camera? Not that many. Steven Spielberg did because he had a Super 8 camera, like a couple others did. And most people just shot a bunch of crap at their own house, like, so I think it is going to be a little bit like that personally, like I think there's only so many people who are truly talented and know how to tell a story that can resonate with an audience, and whatever format that's in, whether that's 30 seconds or 7 minutes or a feature length film, there is a talent to it, and again, some of the stuff that like I don't understand and I don't get on YouTube, I still give them credit for, because I'm like, you have clearly locked into an audience, like, how to tell a story for your audience. Again, everyone's trying to be a YouTube creator. There's only so many that are like actually really successful, and I think I don't know that the ratio is going to change because of AI. It is going to allow more people, like there will be a George Lucas in his dorm room who will make Star Wars. And this time he'll just make Star Wars. He won't have to do THX 1138 as a short to then rise up to Star Wars 10 years later. He'll just go make it, and that will happen, and it will be probably an earth shattering moment for our business when someone's like, that's as good as Denis Villeneuve's Dune, like that'll be a big moment. And that person will then be catapulted into a different rank and they'll make movies in a different way. I just don't think there's going to be that many of them, and so, I think from more than anything, it's like, here's a dumb thing your aunt sent you that was generated by AI that comes in an email, and you're like, okay. It feels like a lot of this is going to be very disposable, so I think to really like hold an audience's attention in a way that can actually generate revenue is still going to come down to someone having the keys to the controls, who has a creative point of view, who can tell a story that matters and resonates with somebody, and it will open the door to more people probably. But again, so did video cameras, iPhone. Anyone can make a movie on their phone now. It looks cinema quality. What's your favorite iPhone shot movie you've ever seen?
It's like a BMW commercial, I think I saw.
That probably cost $12 million to shoot with an iPhone. So, that's sort of what I think will happen, and again, why we're trying to like partner with IP holders and creators and people that we think really can tell a story. And the way we're doing it with Spurry is like, we're not doing any sort of text to pixel AI prompts. Like it's not part of our DNA at all. It's all about sort of AI tools for the in-between steps of animation. So it's sort of like, how do you speed up lighting or blocking or all these things that are part of the process where, quite honestly, animation's expensive just because of time. It's time and man hours, and it's iteration, and it's putting things on its feet to see that it doesn't work, to then keep remaking it. If you could do all of that faster, if you could sort of see it on its feet sooner, correct it and make it again and get to the good version faster, you'll save a lot of money. So that's more our bet than anything. Give those tools to creators to help speed up parts of the process to create efficiencies, but not to take any control out of artists and creators' hands.
Now, you keep talking about the artist or creator in terms of like the screenwriters and the directors and that sort of thing. But what about the actors here? If you have, I'm sure Tilly Norwood is one that, we all saw come up. If you have, they look just like humans and they walk around and they say the things that the screenwriter wants them to play, do you think that could be more of a fundamental difference? Or do you also think they'll permanently be, it's always going to be human actors?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this will be one of those things where like the first time you see a performance by Tilly Norwood that makes you cry, where you're like, that's as good as any human actor. Like that'll again be another landmark shift in our business, and I think I haven't seen that yet. I've seen a lot of like beautiful AI people walk around a city that looks like Tokyo at night, like I haven't seen anything where I'm like, wow, that my engagement. But again, I also feel that about a lot of actors. There's only so many actors that like really do that for you. And then there's a lot of people trying to act and trying to be actors. And again, there's only ever going to be a certain percentage where you're like, these are exceptional talents. AI is going to have to prove you can be in the exceptional talent zone, I think, to fully replace that. I'm not saying it's impossible, though. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, I don't know. And I don't think an audience will care that much in a few years, and you'll probably just go back to like the basics, which I think most consumers go by is, did I like it? Like, I don't think people spend I spend a ton of time watching things, analyzing it. What was the direction? Would that be a director I want to work with? What about the actor? Most people are on their couch and it's like, nah, wasn't that good? I liked it. Like that's most people's reactions. If that can be achieved with an AI actor, like that is it will shift our business, and I think we'll try to do everything we can to protect that as much as possible. But it's also a strange, slippery slope because like there's things that happen in VFX already, and they've been happening for years. You create something called a digi-double. So let's say, you've got an actor running across a road, and then you cut to a really wide shot where they jump off a building. A lot of times you just do that now with like, you scan the actor and you can sort of create this like digi-double of the actor jumping off the building. So you don't have to do that stunt. You don't have to shoot the actor jumping off. And in some ways the actor's like, great, well, that's one less day I have to do this. I get paid the same either way, and it's going to be CG anyway. So it's interesting. There's already things that have been in the pipeline before of like, oh, actually it would just be simpler to do this so that we don't have to, string this actor up on a wire for a thing that we can obviously do in VFX. And it's just going to be more efficient to do it holistically in shot. Those things I think everyone's okay with, so like how much replacement of a performance are you going to be okay with, or if you're Al Pacino and you got scanned and they created an entire Al Pacino performance with you, but it was you and you got paid for it. Are you okay with that? Or are you not? And I think that's like the fundamental debates that everyone is having right now, and obviously image and likeness and what you can sort of, control is a part of it. And then it's also about what is AI actually able to achieve with these performances. So
I had a question that I feel like everyone wants to ask, John, is you finish watching a movie and you're like, that was just crap. Like, how did that get greenlit? Can you quickly answer, like, and it's all relative. I'm sure some, like, it's not actually all crap, but there's quite a bit that's crap that seems to get released. And I think about it, and I was like, that was millions of dollars that got burned. Is it some of it like point of no return? Some of it like someone really does believe, no, it's not actual crap. It'll make it through. Like what goes behind, like, in a quick way? Could you?
I mean, I would say 99 out of 100, nobody thought it was crap at the start. Like maybe 1 out of 100 there, there could be a vanity project sort of thing. There's a big piece of talent you're in business with. They really want to do this thing. But they do that thing, then they'll do the third one of your franchise. So fine, we'll just make it. And hope it turns out well. And no, it didn't, but we sort of knew that. But hey, we had to do it anyway. That's a rare thing that might explain a few of those. But for the most part, it's stuff that everybody thought was going to be great, and for one reason or another, and sometimes it's like, it's a great idea for a movie and we've got blank director who's great. And this actor wants to work with this director. So that actor will do it. And they're great on a press tour. So they really got to push this movie out. The script's not good yet, but like, we'll get it there. And then you try, and then you unravel the script. And then by the time you're shooting, you're trying to like rewrite the script every day. And it just becomes a mess, and it was sort of all done in the intention of like, yeah, but that actor can only shoot from May to July. And that director, now this other studio is trying to steal that director. So if you don't make them pay or play and make this movie, they're going to go do this other movie. Oh, we don't want to lose that director. And we don't want to miss this window for this actor. Let's just make sure we make the script good by then, and then it's a creative alchemy that is a really hard thing to figure out, and I think it's one of those things like when you're in it, you make these tiny choices, most of which you think are the best things, or some of them are sort of battles lost, but you're like, yeah, that's not great, but it's not that big of a deal. Like we can work around that, or we could probably cut around that, or you have a bad day of shooting, but it's like these paper cuts add up. And then all of a sudden you've got a thing that just feels a bit Frankenstein, and then you try to fix it in post, but now you're actually just Frankensteining it more because, well, we didn't get that thing. So now we're shuffling this thing. And now we've sort of, why did we make this movie again? What was the theme? What was the point? And you lose the plot along the way. I mean, more often than not, it comes down to script, quite honestly, and it comes down to try to like putting things on the rails with a script that maybe wasn't ready. I also think there is something to be said for the rigor that goes into making movies when it's applied and when it's not, and I say this as like a somewhat old school, at least at the moment, trained studio executive, but I do think there's like value in the tension between studio executive, producer, director, actors, screenwriter, being really engaged in the sort of stress testing everything to make it great, I think is part of the process. And I do think in a world, especially when streaming came along, what happened in our business was like a lot of packages went out, basically meant like to maximize money on selling a project, agents, or sometimes agents and producers, and sometimes an agent and a star, whatever, they would put like a director, a star, maybe a second star. They'd have a script, and they just, this is the movie we want to make. And then everyone would bid on it because they're like, oh, we don't have a movie for fall 2027. And oh, this could start right away. And it sort of takes the risky part out of the job for studio executives, because it's, I don't have to just buy a script and then do 5 rewrites on it and then hope I get that star and then hope I get that other star and then hope we land a director. That's a lot of variables. This takes all the variables out of the mix. However, it also is them saying, this is what we want to make. Don't give us any notes. We want the money and we want your distribution slot. And I do think sometimes that has led to a process where there's not as much friction, not as much challenging of creativity, because a lot of times studios are like, oh, this person, just let them do their thing, or don't give that star that note because they won't like it, and again, there's a way to challenge great filmmakers and great actors that's not condescending, that doesn't take away their ownership of like this career they've established, but also just says, hey, I want everything you do to be your best. Let's be rigorous about it. Let's put this through, let's stress test every decision. And I'm not sure every movie, more and more, I think fewer movies go through that process, so.
John, maybe if you back it up a little bit. So like in terms of making the movie, maybe on the other side of the spectrum to the question that I know that everybody is always asking. At the beginning of the movie, there's 10 opening credits of different studios and producers and who knows what. Like, how does a movie get made? You mentioned buying a script. Who's buying the script? What does the producer do? What do the execs do? Who's financing the movies? How do these things, what does this ecosystem look like?
Yeah, I mean,
and I'm sure that's a very easy answer.
Yeah, no, but it's predominantly 2 fundamental things. Is it a studio movie or is it an independent movie? And so those are 2 different things. I've predominantly worked, both having worked at a studio and then been a producer who's had a first look deal at studios and mostly made studio movies. I've predominantly worked in that category. But a studio movie just means one of these big buyers and distributors is actually paying for the movie. And so like you as a producer, your job is sort of the middleman. Find a book, find a script, find something, maybe attach a piece of talent, sell this thing to them, convince them that this is the next big movie you guys should make. They buy it, then they'll have notes, and then they'll put it through a process. They'll decide what the budget should be. They run P&Ls, which is like the profit and loss model, which basically says, here's the low, middle, and high case for movies like this. Here's 20 movies like it. Roughly, it means the budget should probably be about $45 million. Can you make it for that? Currently, it's probably $58 million. Okay, let's rewrite it down. Let's get it into a box. But eventually, you sort of get to a place with a studio of like, they like the script, they like the package, they believe that this is a good movie for their slate. You get to the number that they want to make the movie at as a budget, and then they greenlight it. And then you're off and running, and now they're paying for pre-production, they're paying for production. They own the movie too. So in that situation, that's why you're sort of like a fee for hire worker as a producer. Like you're trying to connect all these dots and you're getting paid a fee for what you're doing. In the independent space, it's different. And it's much more the Wild West, because you could determine the budget, you could have more than enough people wanting to put money into your movie, and suddenly you've got $20 million to make a movie that maybe you should have only made for 10, but wow, we've got more money than not. Probably it's the opposite more often now, and the independent space has become very, very hard. So, it's, hey, we think this is like a $10 million awards level Academy Award movie. You got $5 million. Like this person wants to put in 2, this person wants to put in 1, this person wants to put in 2. And usually when those people put in money, they want producer credits. So they don't actually produce the movie, but they want producer credit because they're financing it and they're a key part of how it's getting made. Or an actor's in it, but I've never gotten a producer credit before, but it's an independent, so I want a producer credit. So that's when you sometimes see all these producer and executive producer credits stacked. Because everybody and their mother wants to be a producer in some way. Technically there should be kind of one central producer who's really the person who's like putting this movie on their back, trying to put all the pieces together. It's actually, I'm part of a group now called Producers United, which is a new organization that started in Hollywood about 18 months ago, which is, has grown. It sort of started as a group of about 60 or 70 producers. I think it's well over 200 now. And they're really trying to define this term career producer, which is essentially someone who's producing the movie who only gets paid to produce the movie. So it is different than being a writer producer, a director producer, an actor producer, a financier producer. So, again, it's a credit that gives people a shot at having their name on the movie, but they're not necessarily the ones putting every piece together, making sure this movie comes in quality, on budget, all these other things that you're sort of obligated to deliver as a producer on these movies. But again, there's no real process to getting a movie made in once you think you have enough money to make the movie, let's say $5 million gives you 28 days of shooting. You see the director, great. You got 28 days, like go make it, and so and then sometimes those movies can be pre-sold, so they'll find distributors, but sometimes those movies go to festivals. They hope to be sold, and sometimes they don't get sold, so somebody put in 2 million, 1 million, 2 million, $5 million movie sitting there. Eventually you'll find some way for someone to take it on for $1 million, and it might be a $4 million loss, so there's risk involved. Whereas with the studio, they're paying for it. They're taking on the risk, because if the movie fails and loses $40 million, you still got paid a fee. The actor still got paid a fee. The director still got paid a fee. Studio loses 40 million. However, when they make a huge hit, they also are getting almost all the upside.
Yeah, I had another question around, for a long time, it seemed like this comic book or superhero movie trend was just sort of perpetual, and there would be yet another Spider-Man. It seems like that has finally peaked. Kind of what was behind that, and what has, finally sort of drawn down that trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, there was a lot of comparison to the Western, even in like 2001 when the superhero genre really took off, and obviously there were some really good superhero movies in the 90s, but I feel like the first Spider-Man after 9/11 felt to me sort of like the beginning of like this sort of, it's the Western American, it's the new genre. And, it had essentially a 20-year life cycle, which is pretty long for a genre to be that strong. I think in some ways, like Marvel was so dominant in the process and did such a good job building every single piece to lead to those 2 Avengers movies, to lead to Endgame, that it was hard to know where to go from there, and I think there was a sort of finality to that everyone was sort of like, I was on this, especially if you were like a kid who grew up in the early 2000s, like that was your life, like meeting Iron Man in 2008, getting to Endgame. Like this is such an epic journey that I think did feel like there was some closure to it. There was also like how many different variations of a superhero movie can you tell? There's a revisionist one, there's a comedic one, we'd sort of gone through a lot of them, and now I think it's just back to being a genre where like if you make a really, really, really good one that people really want to see with a bunch of people they want to see in it, they'll probably still go. Like I don't think it's like the genre's head. I just don't think it has the automatic, hey, there was definitely, without naming names, some Marvel movies that I think got away with it, like on that, there were some really good ones and there were some ones that were sort of like, yeah, you just have to see it because it's all part of this interconnected universe. It doesn't really matter if it's great or not. We love it anyway. I don't think you're getting a free pass in the genre anymore. And I think it also, I do think streaming was a part of that too. I think making a lot of superhero shows for streaming, a few superhero movies for streaming, sort of felt like there was just then this inundation during COVID. I can get it anywhere. It doesn't feel special anymore. But we're going to get another Avengers movie next year, with Robert Downey's going to be back in, it'll be a good test. I mean, is that a 1.5 to $2 billion movie again? And if it is, then great. I don't know that that'll also say the genre's back. I think that'll say, hey, if you get all the Avengers back in a movie and you get Robert Downey back in a movie, people will still really like it. But again, I think that's all sort of speaking to this larger thing in Hollywood, which is like everything has to be so big, so noisy, such a destination for consumers. And if it's not, it can easily just sort of peter away.
I guess, what I was imagining you're going to say there was something around risk aversion, which may be a flavor of what you're talking about. And I would guess is why all these relatively bad sequels get made, because you feel like there's a lot less variability there. If this world you're talking about, hey, with AI, we can bring down some of this cost comes to pass, do you think that will lead to maybe more artistic freedom or, willingness to take risks because it's not such a big bet on one that has less of, predictability than a sequel or another comic superhero movie?
Yeah, maybe. I think it's going to somewhat come down to the filmmakers too, though. There is a group of filmmakers, and like Ryan Coogler, Denis Villeneuve, some of these guys are at the forefront of. If they say they want to do a black and white movie about their childhood, you'll probably get greenlit tomorrow. Sinners is a risk, it's an original movie and he took on the bulk of that, was going to wear it one way or the other, turns out to be a great, a huge hit for him and just sort of puts him even further into that next strata. But there are people like that just say, hey, this is what I want to do. Zach Cregger, I think, is sort of that now after Weapons and Barbarian. If they want to make original movies, there are people to back them. I'm not sure technology lowering the budget will make you take big swings on unproven filmmakers. I think that's the filmmaker sometimes is almost the equivalent of the brand, so it's like greenlighting an Avengers movie or greenlighting a Chris Nolan movie isn't that different. Even if it's an original Chris Nolan movie, like it is branded in its own way, so there's actually not that much risk. No one's going to get fired. If that happens to be like the first bad Chris Nolan movie that doesn't work, no one's getting fired for making that movie. So I think a lot of the risk aversion, some of it is related to price, but a lot of it is like, is this a decision I can get fired for? And greenlighting a sequel to a successful movie, you're probably not going to get fired for. Greenlighting a movie from Chris Nolan or Ryan Coogler or Denis Villeneuve, you're not going to get fired for. Everything in between that's like, that could have a Monday morning quarterbacking. Why'd you do that? Why'd you bet on that guy? Like, why'd you bet? Like sometimes these movies that have failed, there's movies that like will be considered bombs where you're like, it's not that expensive. I mean, it didn't lose that much relative to some other, but there's these perceptions around certain movies, and there's movies that like the town seems to want to go after as failures. And there's some that seem to get a free pass. But I think that drives a lot of it. So, I don't know it could help, certainly. I still think the filmmaker doing something really bold and original is going to have to be of a certain caliber, a certain status to get people to bet on them. Or they find a way to make what you would consider a $50-60 million movie for $10 million. Then you just do it outside the studio system where you don't have to have someone, take that bet and that risk. Sean Baker can make a Nora because it doesn't cost that much, and he doesn't need Disney or Netflix or Paramount to greenlight an aura. So, and if you could make an aura that had $50 million of VFX in it, but you could do it cheaper, yeah, it's possible, but I think that's probably the only way I think it really would shape like originality or creativity sort of, burgeoning in a new way.
Really appreciate you being so generous with your time here. For those who are listening who want to, follow along with what you're doing, get in touch. What's the best way to follow your work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a website for Rideback. You can sort of see all the productions we've had that have come out before and follow us there. I can reach out to you and get my email if anyone has specific questions, about the business, or is interested in getting into the business in some capacity. It's funny, we talk about all the issues of it today, but at the same time, like, I love it. I think it's the most fun business to work in. Like, I love my job. I love our company. I love what we do. It is hard. It is harder in certain ways. And again, you hear about what it was like in the 90s. And, yeah, there's part of you that's like, that would be fun if it was like that again. It's not. And even as is today, like, it's still a pretty great job. Like I love doing what we do. I love sitting down with creative people all day long. You have to understand them. You have to understand their story to understand what kind of story they're going to tell. Like, that part is fascinating. And I like the sort of, there's a right brain, left brain quality to it that I really love. Like there's a math brain side to me that loves the sort of, okay, economics, we'd have to do this. What are the steps at this budget? If we made it there, that would minimize risk. Like that part of like these two things coming together, I really love. So as much as like there's a lot of doing around the business, like I also think there's a lot that is still amazing about it.
If I'm going to ask a bonus question, then what advice would you give somebody, maybe yourself 20 years ago, coming out of college, looking to get in the industry? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's the same path to get into the industry. I think it's sort of the same, I think it's interning, it's working at agencies where you see sort of the nexus of information for Hollywood. It's getting a job as an assistant, working for somebody smart you can sort of learn under. I think the next thing though is where it gets more complicated, where like it did feel like there's a little bit of a stepping stones for me of like, okay, so you do this, you become an assistant, then you get promoted to creative executive, then you become a director of development, then a vice president, and then a senior. Like, you sort of knew what it was and you could do this at a studio or production company. I think that sort of path is not as easily laid out as much, So I would say get your sort of Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours in the business at an agency, at an internship, as an assistant, learn all you need to know. But then I think you've got to be more entrepreneurial in the way you forge your own path and, be really in tune with what's happening at YouTube. Understand why creators are having the success they're having, be aware of what are some of these other smaller companies popping up that are doing interesting things. Like, where are there opportunities for ownership? Where are there, where's the next Netflix going to come in from the outside? I think if you can latch onto one of those companies, or you can latch on a piece of talent or a creator early on, you can have an enormous amount of success. I just think if you just sort of think like, oh, I'll just do my time, I'll get promoted, and eventually I'll run the company. That path feels harder now, I think, than ever before. So I think it really is understand the business you're getting into and then figure out, how do I forge my own path?
Well, thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your expertise with us.
No, it's been fun. Thank you guys for having me. This has been great.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.